It's My Nerd World, a space opera podcast. I'm your host, Jon Justice, and took a few weeks off, but we're back. And this week, a bit of a cheat. We're going to be talking about The Rise of Skywalker, not as a Star Wars film, but as a space opera. I'm going to lay out my arguments as to why The Rise of Skywalker is one of the best space opera films of the last, I will say, 20 years. Plus, we'll talk a little Raised by Wolves. That series has wrapped up. I'll give you my thoughts. And we have listener feedback. Welcome to the show.
My Nerd World.
It is My Nerd World, and I'm glad you're back with the Space Opera Podcast this week. I am Jon Justice, and I did take a little bit of time off. There's been a lot going on, and I have been working really hard on my science fiction space opera series, Embark, available now in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. You're listening to an audio podcast. You like space operas. Go and pick yourself up the Embark trilogy, which is a fresh and relevant take on the modern-day space opera. It's available on Amazon.com. Go to mynerdworld.net. So I took a couple of weeks off, and in that time, I've been jotting down notes about future space opera podcasts that I'm planning, and I hope to be a little bit more consistent, and I apologize for that. That's the one thing about doing podcasts that you really got to do, is you got to make sure that you have a level of consistency when pumping out new programs. And unfortunately, when you have a full-time job and you've tackled as many things, right, self-inflicted busyness as I have, there's a few things that fall by the wayside. And unfortunately, for the past 2 weeks, that was the nature of a space opera podcast. But I'm glad the show is back this week and really looking forward to getting into a couple of items on this week's show. It's going to be a bit of a cheat, and I admit that. I do host a Star Wars podcast. I do talk about the sequel trilogy and certainly The Rise of Skywalker being the most recently released theatrical film in the Skywalker series. And I am going to be talking about The Rise of Skywalker on this show today. But the reason I'm going to be doing that is because I want to take some time and talk about The Rise of Skywalker as a space opera film by itself and try to separate it out from the Star Wars trilogy and from the Star Wars saga as a whole. It's one of the things, one of many, but it's one of the things that I believe puts a ton of pressure on these films, is that they're not just science fiction movies. The Star Wars films are not just space operas. The Star Wars films, they are nostalgia. They are life, for lack of a better term for a lot of people. They are of incredible importance to generations and millions of fans, and have been since 1972. And because of that, I feel like the films get treated rather unfairly on their own merits. It's one of the things that the sequel trilogy is unique for, because the sequel trilogy, having been released at a time in society where we do live in a digital age, and we are interconnected and also disconnected because of that interconnectivity via social media in a way that we haven't ever been before prior to the release of the sequel trilogy, and certainly the first two trilogies in the Star Wars series. And because of that, the films do get picked apart singularly, but rarely do they ever get looked at as their own entities. And I really do believe that the Star Wars films, and especially the sequel trilogies, do work on their own if there were no other Star Wars films. So that's what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. Again, we also have some listener feedback, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. And I want to take a moment, too, and invite you to go to mynerdworld.net. There is an active blog. A couple times a week, I'm putting up some pretty extensive posts on a lot of different issues. This week, there is some brief comments about our president, and our prayers go out to the president, the first lady, and the administration that's suffering from COVID-19. That's as political as I'm going to get, apart from saying that I do pray for our president and those that have been infected with COVID-19 and hope that everybody pulls through quickly. We need leadership in this country right now. But the blog is focused on pop culture. And so there's a lot of different things that I tackle, including some behind-the-scenes looks at my Embark Science Fiction Space Opera series. Also there is a brand new link to join my newsletter. I'm switching from a mailing list to a newsletter, and I have some really cool exclusives just for the individuals that sign up for the free newsletter. So if you haven't done that already, please go to mynerdworld.net and hit the link. It's right there on the homepage under the link where you can get details about the Embark Space Opera series. All right, so let's start off here and talk a little Raised by Wolves, the science fiction series on HBO Max. So I was really hyped up for Raised by Wolves for a number of different reasons. I love the fact that we're getting live-action science fiction stories on the small screen, streaming, and that we've reached a place now where the special effects, and more specifically the costs of the special effects that we get in these shows, is such that the quality of the actual production is pretty spot on. It's one of the issues that I have with so many older great science fiction shows. I just have a really difficult time working past the limited budget and the wonky late 90s, early 2000s special effects. And we're going to get into a bit of that in listener feedback this week. Friend of the show, Eric, makes a comment about some of those past series, and I'll dive a little bit more into my hesitation to dive into them just because I have such a difficult time working past the special effects. But I love the fact now that any new science fiction series you get, for the most part, is going to have a good amount of solid special effects. And if they're not, they are going to make sure the special effects they do have, even if they're limited because of the budget, are solid as well. There's a good level of consistency in terms of the aesthetic of these shows on TV. So I was excited by that. The subject matter of Raised by Wolves being so close to Ridley Scott's Alien universe. And I'm still not convinced, man, and we'll get into this here in a moment, that this is not connected to the Alien universe. If so, I can't decide whether or not I'm annoyed that Ridley Scott lifted so much of his Alien universe and put it into Raised by Wolves. So, started watching the series with my wife, finished it last night, and at this point, before I get into some details and a little bit of spoilers here, I'm not going to get all into it. So not full spoilers, but more just sort of your surface level trailer-esque stuff that you would see in promotional material for Raised by Wolves. I will continue to watch the series. There's definitely going to be a season 2, unless it didn't do well enough to warrant a season 2, but they did not wrap up the story enough for it to be just a singular series on its own. I'll definitely watch season 2. But if I'm going to rate it on a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst, I'm probably going to give it around a 6. There were episodes that teetered on 7s, 8s, and almost 9s at the start of the series, but it took some really weird turns that I felt the series didn't need to take. Now, that's a difficult thing to say, because I'm very much an advocate of the subjectivity of looking at art, right? It's all subjective. It's what you want. And I can't help, as an individual writing stories myself, to look at these shows, especially a streaming show where you have, a lot of content to analyze and examine. I can't help but look at them from a creative lens going, well, maybe I would have done this and maybe I would have done that. So I'll kind of focus on just what I didn't like. I didn't like the fact that the show itself deviated from being grounded in a sense of reality. You are looking at a future where you have androids that can morph and fly, called necromancers, and they have unique and interesting abilities, especially defensive and offensive abilities. Like, that I can get into, and flying ships and stuff I can get into. I don't mind the religious aspect, obviously, of shows. I find that really interesting and unique. But for me, I'd like a little bit more specificity as to why certain things are happening, rather than leaving it as open and ambiguous as Raised by Wolves ended up doing towards the end. I don't need my hand held. I like smart sci-fi, but don't leave me completely hanging where I'm still kind of scratching my head at the end of the series. It got a little too graphic for my tastes, and that's a total personal thing for me. I just don't like, I don't mind horror to a certain extent. I don't mind, blood and guts, and even the occasional sexuality or sex, as long as it's, for me, done tastefully with my fingers. If it's me creating it, I'm going to default to less is more for circumstances like that. But there were some moments where several of the middle episodes just dragged way, way too much. Heading into the last few episodes in the season finale, I was theorizing that this was potentially a reboot of the Alien universe. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, the Raised by Wolves series and Ridley Scott's hand in it does lift just a ton from his Alien universe. The moments where the androids or the humans in the show go into a computer simulation, right? Sort of a very generic way of saying when they're plugging in and going into a simulation. The textures and the graphics they use for that simulation are identical to what was used inside of Ridley Scott's most recent Alien films, Prometheus and Alien Covenant. The androids themselves might as well have come from the Alien universe. They look the same, they talk the same, they have the same white blood. Even one of the episodes where the main villain, if you will, the mother android, goes inside the wrecked Ark human ship, she comes across some maintenance androids. Those maintenance androids look identical to the maintenance androids that were inside of the Alien Isolation video game, which I really enjoyed. I was like shocked when I saw it. I was like, oh my gosh, those are the stupid androids that I couldn't kill in the video game that were so mind-numbingly frustrating. So this sent me down a path that this could be a potential soft reboot of the Alien universe. Now, I'm not still 100% sure that's not the case. And without any spoilers, the season finale of season 1 of Raised by Wolves did leave a lot on the table. I didn't find the finale very satisfying. It left a lot of questions. I would have liked a few more answers. Ultimately, it felt like it was trying to be Prometheus. And that's probably, if I was going to have an issue with it from a personal angle, that's probably my biggest issue with it. I am a big fan of Prometheus. I really got into and appreciated what Ridley Scott was trying to do with his prequels to the Alien series. I know the Prometheus was not everybody's bag. It is a strange alien movie. Ridley Scott really does open up the Alien universe in unique ways, but he did world building in there that I thought was really interesting and unique. This idea of engineers and the idea of these engineers talking about Prometheus from another planet being the individuals who put humans on Earth, but then also having to reconcile Christianity and the beliefs of the main female protagonist from Prometheus in God, I thought was really fascinating. On top of the technology, the androids, and ultimately the inception of the alien creature that we all came to become so familiar with and were such fans of inside of those original Alien films. Now, if you've never seen Prometheus, do not misunderstand. It is weird, and it's pretty graphic, as much as the, if not more, the original Alien. And it really does sort of flip the script on what our preconceived ideas were or what we knew about the alien creatures. And it does strip away a lot of the really cool, ambiguity from that original Alien movie. And the Alien films, not to wipe out on this too much, because they kind of do fall into that space opera category. I would move back further from Raised by Wolves from the space opera category, if we're being honest. I started that show off on this space opera podcast because of the similarities it have with the vast majority of your space operas and defining a space opera, right? At the end of the day, I probably, after watching the whole series, probably would not put it fully in the space opera category, even though it shares some similarities there. The thing that I always found interesting about the Alien universe, and specifically going back to the 70s and looking at Alien and Aliens, those first two movies, is that they really do have quite a bit in common when you look at the timeline of the series itself with the Star Wars movies and what the directors and the creators of that franchise and Alien did that really does align quite a bit with what George Lucas did. Meaning George Lucas going back and doing the prequels and giving us the story of Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi and how he became Darth Vader. Spoiler alert. It really is very much like what Ridley Scott did in going back in Prometheus and Alien Covenant and trying to tell the backstory of that original classic 70s, 80s film. And people have argued, much like they did with Star Wars at the time of the prequels, of whether or not it was necessary. Again, doubling back, I really like Prometheus and Alien Covenant, and I know Ridley Scott has said that he's planning on sort of redoing and revisiting Alien, but starting over, which is really kind of bumming me out because I would have liked one more movie to connect Alien Covenant to that original Alien film. But be that as it may, let's get back to Raised by Wolves for a moment. The end of Raised by Wolves felt like Prometheus to me in a lot of ways. I mean, and actually, the more that I even think about it, and right now as I speak, it really does remind me like it's more. It really does feel like it was more of a soft reboot of Prometheus than it was of the original Alien movies. Which, again, I can't help but wonder if that's where Ridley Scott is going. If this is actually going to be connected to Prometheus in some way, even though the timelines don't really match up. But that was probably my biggest issue. Is that the end of Raised by Wolves was in a lot of ways a bit of a carbon copy of Prometheus, and it makes me scratch my head going, Ridley Scott is an incredible filmmaker, an incredible writer, and he's got to know that. So what is he doing? So that enough is going to keep me watching this show just to find out what ends up happening. I'll say that at the end of the day, if Raised by Wolves continues and it's not connected with the Alien universe at all, that's really weird. Because that's going to be one of the first times that I've ever seen a director, a creator of content, lift so much from one universe and put it into another universe without tying it in. Unless it was simply just a matter of, we have those designs, I like those designs, let's put them in our Raised by Wolves universe, and if people, see the similarities, great. Most people probably won't, because not a whole lot of people ended up seeing Prometheus and Alien Covenant. So what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Did you watch the series? Were you familiar with Prometheus? Did you see the parallels? Did you take away what I took away? Or do you have a completely different opinion? I'd really like to know. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com.
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?
All right, let's talk a little Rise of Skywalker. And I know this is a cheat. And I know I've got a lot of people listening to this podcast, if not the vast majority of you that listen to this podcast that also listen to my Star Wars podcast that are going, why don't you just do this on your Star Wars podcast? You've talked about that movie a ton already. Well, first off, I love The Rise of Skywalker. I can never talk too much about that film, kind of like the way that I was for The Last Jedi. But secondly, like I said before, I didn't want to do this on the Star Wars podcast because I've talked about it so much, and I really just wanted to focus on The Rise of Skywalker from the standpoint of being a space opera and the elements that you get in a space opera, a sweeping epic with a lot of adventure, with fantasy elements involving multiple species of aliens, right? Good versus evil, space battles. And The Rise of Skywalker, and one of the reasons why I think I love this movie so much, is that not only for me does it work as the finale of the 9-part saga, could it work better? Sure. But it really also works just as a standalone film. Now, if you're going, well, not really, John, because you kind of got to see the first two movies of The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi at least, or certainly the original trilogy to understand The Rise of Skywalker. So if you are asking yourself that question, I am going to say, do you really? Let me give you an example. We'll start off right at the beginning. I've basically taken a handful of points to discuss the space opera aspect versus it just being a Star Wars film. And we'll start off specifically with The Crawl. Let's go back in time to 1977. And as a promotion for the Star Wars podcast this week, one of the things they're going to be talking about, the main topic on the Star Wars podcast this week, is going to be what makes Star Wars great in terms of creating the stories. And specifically, what did George Lucas set out to do originally, and why did it end up working? I mean, sometimes you're just blessed, man. Sometimes God just goes, that's going to be huge, you're welcome. The original Star Wars hit at a certain time in the country, at a certain time in pop culture and in cinema, where nobody had really seen anything like this. And you had a generation of children who were exposed to something that they never even knew, a world that they can relate to, but that was also set in this fantastical place in a galaxy far, far away that just sparked the imagination of millions of little kids and their parents around the planet. But going back to A New Hope, reading The Crawl and remembering that Star Wars, first off, didn't have A New Hope title attached to it. So when George Lucas released it, it was just a movie. It was a space opera before it was a Star Wars movie. We look at Star Wars almost as if it's its own genre. And there are arguments to be made that Star Wars is indeed its own genre. However, I'm going to look at this from just the angle of it being a space opera with the other films that we've talked about. Whether it's, Serenity or Jupiter Ascending or Valerian, right? And these are more films that we'll be covering on the Titan AE that we'll be talking about on the show. When I was 5 years old and I went with my father to go see A New Hope, at the time, just Star Wars, when that yellow crawl rolled across the screen that George Lucas had lifted from the Saturday morning Flash Gordon serials of his own youth, this is all we knew. It is a period of civil war. Rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base have won their first victory against the evil Galactic Empire. During the battle, Rebel spies managed to steal secret plans to the Empire's ultimate weapon, the Death Star, an armored space station with enough power to destroy an entire planet. Pursued by the Empire's sinister agents, Princess Leia races home aboard her starship, custodian of the stolen plans that can save her people and restore freedom to the galaxy. We didn't know anything about the Star Wars universe. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Bam! There it is. Sets the stage. Then we get that opening crawl that I just read that gives you all the details that you need to lock yourselves into this story. And what are you presented with? A very stark and clear, definitive good versus evil tale. The bad guy's wearing black. The good girl at the beginning is wearing white. I mean, it doesn't get... There you go. It's right there. And you're in it for the ride. You didn't need backstory. You didn't need ancillary material. You weren't asking. And maybe it's unfair to say you. They weren't asking. I wasn't asking for ancillary material. What's this, Imperial Senate that this Tarkin guy is talking about? Why didn't they go and show us this? Is Darth Vader a robot? What about the stormtroopers? I thought when I was a kid, stormtroopers were robots. But I wasn't sitting back going, why didn't they explain that they were clones? We didn't do any of that. We just opened up our eyes and just allowed ourselves to get immersed into this fantastical world that George Lucas had created without knowing anything else. And when Star Wars came out, it was just Star Wars. And everybody loved it, and it became the cultural phenomenon that has sparked thousands of podcasts, millions of Twitter battles after all these years, right? It worked all by itself. Now, let's flash forward to 2019 and December. And Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. Episode 9, the last of the Skywalker saga films. directed by J.J. Abrams. And we'll do exactly the same thing. Let's go, and we'll start off with the opening crawl from The Rise of Skywalker. The dead speak. The galaxy heard a mysterious broadcast, a threat of revenge in the sinister voice of the late Emperor Palpatine. General Leia Organa dispatches secret agents to gather intelligence, while Rey, the last hope of the Jedi, trains for battle against the diabolical First Order. Meanwhile, Supreme Leader Kylo Ren rages in search of the Phantom Emperor, determined to destroy any threat to his power. Now, criticism. Doesn't flow as good as the original trilogy crawl. Could be an observation based off of the 40-plus years that I've been living with that crawl from A New Hope versus the not even a year that I've been living with the crawl from The Rise of Skywalker. That being said, it is no less effective or ambiguous as the A New Hope original Star Wars movie crawl was. We just happen to have hours upon hours of other material that led up to this particular movie. But if you take The Rise of Skywalker and just release it without any other Star Wars films out there, I'm going to argue that crawl works all by itself and gives you all you need to know. There's a dead emperor who's vowing revenge. There's a princess, a General Leia Organa, who dispatches agents to gather intelligence because of this dead emperor who's vowing revenge, while Rey, let's just imagine you never heard of her before. The last hope of the Jedi, oh, that's interesting. Oh, she's training. Okay, this must be some type of warrior for battle against the diabolical First Order. Ah, main bad guys. Meanwhile, Supreme Leader, oh, he must be the leader of the bad guys, rages in search of the Phantom Emperor, that dude that was dead in the beginning, determined to destroy any threat to his power. There you go. It's a little more convoluted than A New Hope, I'll grant you that. But at the same time, it is just as ambiguous and sets the stage for this epic science fiction space opera film. And as you get into the details of the movie and as it plays out, try, if you want to have some fun, okay? If you want to have some fun, watch The Rise of Skywalker and just watch it from a movie standpoint, if you can do that. I mean, that's kind of what I do. Because I can shift back and forth. There's a lot of times where, just because of how I consume content, I watch movies and listen to music based off my mood. I'm like George Costanza from Seinfeld, for those that get the reference, right? I usually dress for mood. Well, what's this look today? This is Morning Mist. I watch films that way. And there are times when I'll sit back and go, well, I really want to watch blank, but I also, I really want to watch The Rise of Skywalker, but I also kind of really want to watch The Last Jedi. But I want to watch The Rise of Skywalker first, but that seems really dumb, John. You should watch The Last Jedi first because that movie came beforehand. When the truth is, it doesn't really change the movie-going experience. That's just the way my brain works. But sometimes I'll sit down and go, I just want to go on a Star Wars adventure. And I can do this with most of the Star Wars films, and I think that The Rise of Skywalker does it better being observed and providing entertainment as just a film than most any of the other Star Wars movies. You can't do that with Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, in my opinion, right? Empire Strikes Back, you might be able to get into it without seeing A New Hope, but you're going to be a little lost, right? The story in The Empire Strikes Back is more of a character tale than it is sort of we've got a MacGuffin, we need to go and handle that MacGuffin, right? Which is an element of the Star Wars films, not all of them. That's, that works really, really well. Less so and absent from the prequel trilogy, but those were definitely character-driven films. But then by the end of The Empire Strikes Back, you get this cliffhanger that you have to watch Return of the Jedi for. And the same thing kind of speaks for Return of the Jedi. You start off with a guy who is encased and frozen in something in this big slug monster's palace. If you're watching that movie without having ever seen the other ones, you don't have any sort of allegiance to that Han Solo character or any importance, or there's no gravity to him being captured because you spent no time with him before. That isn't necessarily true when it comes to a film like The Last Jedi, or more specifically, because The Last Jedi works as its own film too. more specifically, the Rise of Skywalker. So when you actually dive into the story of the Rise of Skywalker, you get the beginning where the bad guy is searching for the Wayfinder. You get this quick dead opening, they call it, right? You get this quick opening of Kylo Ren finding this Wayfinder, traveling to this planet where we end up meeting instantly that mysterious thought to be dead emperor that was mentioned in the crawl. Then you jump into a handful of our heroes, and again, imagine you're meeting these individuals for the first time, who are on some kind of mission, end up being chased clearly by bad guys. But what are they getting? Well, they're getting information that relates to this message that went out that was in the opening crawl. This sets them on a path when they get back to the heroes, where now we've got a mission at hand. You have a young girl who's training to be some type of warrior. She has a mysterious connection with the bad guy of the film that we saw earlier. And we're immediately presented with a MacGuffin-esque plot where they have to find this Wayfinder because they have to get to this planet because they, too, have to stop this evil bad guy who's emerged at the same time while stopping the real, actual bad guy who has a connection with this girl who's training to be a warrior. Now, my intent is not to go through every single story and plot point of the film. I just wanted to use the opening portion of The Rise of Skywalker to lead as the example of why I feel like this movie works on its own merits as a singular story. Yes, it's wrapping up a 9-story saga that started back in 1977. And I think that some of the criticism when it comes to The Rise of Skywalker from Star Wars fans is probably due to the fact that it does actually work very well on its own as a singular movie. And I imagine that for a lot of people, the Wayfinder element and the Raiders of the Lost Ark Goonies-esque aspect of these friends going on this adventure to search for this thing being added in this last film may have thrown off the average fan who wasn't expecting to get a MacGuffin-esque element in this last movie. Compare that to Revenge of the Sith and Return of the Jedi, you didn't really have that. You had something familiar when it came to wanting to destroy the Death Star 2. You had plans that were already stolen, so it really was more of a poetry, it rhymes, and an echo back to that first movie in the original trilogy. You didn't have this brand new element of Wayfinders and a new planet and a new religious sect that's out there in the Sith Eternal. Within the Star Wars universe, I could see, justifiably for some fans, why they may not have gravitated towards that or connected with that in that way. Why are you adding in all these elements when we already have this other stuff? But what I think that Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams were trying to do is exactly what they said. They wanted a movie that wrapped up the saga, but also sat on its own. And I really do believe that it did that brilliantly. Could it have leaned more into the sequel trilogy and instead of doing Wayfinders and Exegol and Sith Eternal, done more of what Return of the Jedi did in echoing the previous films, the Force Awakens, without adding in new elements or characters? Sure. Did it? No. Did we meet new characters? Yes. Did some characters from other films not get as much screen time as before? Yes. But looking at it just as a space opera, it works really well in the singular. The almost dream-like action and the diversity in the way that the action elements play out in Rey versus Ren, it has that element of fantasy to it that I love. That standoff between Rey and Kylo Ren in the desert, when Kylo Ren is in his TIE Whisper, I adore that scene, even though it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. It reminds me of an old Western standoff, but done completely new and different, where here's this Jedi tapped into the Force who's running through the desert with a lit lightsaber being chased down by her member of the dyad, right? Didn't really know it yet, but we knew there was a connection there, who's pushing her to get her to sort of self-realize what her lineage is, and it works. He crashes and still shows up. She tries to pull the transport that she thinks her Chewbacca furry friend is in, revealing, spoiler alert, force lightning coming from her hands that sends shockwaves through her because now she's totally confused about who she is. I mean, that's the stuff of fantasy films. That's the stuff of fantasy epics that fits really well and works really well inside of the space opera genre. You get into the spaceship battle aspect of it and going to multiple planets. And the Rise of Skywalker is fantastic with regard to that. The space battle at the end, while I had my complaints originally about how it wasn't as linear as I'd liked it to be, upon subsequent viewings, and including the pacing at the beginning of the film that kind of I found a little bit jarring, going back and watching some of the other movies, I realized, you know what, that really isn't all that unlike some other sequences that take place in other Star Wars films, and particularly Rogue One. Rogue One's beginning it plays out very much in the same way that The Rise of Skywalker does. But getting back to this being just its own movie, there is a science fiction fantasy element of The Rise of Skywalker that J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio ended up injecting into this film, which does really make it a fantastic space opera movie. And when you move through the film and you see, oh, okay, this story is really evolving, and oh my gosh, this female that we learned about at the very beginning of the movie that's training to be this Jedi warrior is actually connected to and related to by blood to that bad guy that was mentioned in the opening crawl. Oh my gosh. And she's connected with the baddie who's in the film. Wow, this took a turn. Looking at it through the lens of it not being a Star Wars movie, but just being a singular movie. And so as you barrel towards the finale of this film, along the way you end up getting the wise mentor in Luke Skywalker. You end up getting the passing of another mentor in Leia that means so much to the bad guy in the film, who essentially helps him turn in the same way that Luke Skywalker mentors Rey and helps her on her path towards destiny. And then you reach this climactic finale of arriving on Exegol and these multiple events taking place of Rey facing her grandfather, right? The evil guy mentioned at the beginning of the movie, who plays every bit a part as the ultimate bad guy, along with our heroes going in and having to stop this massive army of planet-destroying spaceships. It doesn't really get much more epic than that, if you're looking at this from a space opera lens and not comparing it to any other films. And that's where I think the Star Wars movies really do get treated unfairly, because they're so often looked at from a lens of being a part of these other movies and not by themselves. And you can do it both ways. It works for me both ways, but I can't help but wonder for those critics of The Rise of Skywalker, if they are capable, or maybe you're a critic of The Rise of Skywalker, if you're capable of going and watching that movie just as a movie. Because like I said, put it up against any other genre, any other movie within the same genre, and it's better. It just is. Those films that I mentioned before, your Serenity, your Valerian, your Jupiter Ascending, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Starship Troopers, Thor Ragnarok. Thor Ragnarok's an interesting one too that I believe also falls into this category. While that movie is praised probably more often than The Rise of Skywalker is, Thor Ragnarok to me also fits into that category of, if I'm just looking for a good space opera, I can go throw in Thor Ragnarok because it's got everything in there, as does Guardians of the Galaxy. Fifth Element. The Rise of Skywalker on its own, paired against other space opera genre films, I believe would be much more well received than it was being a Star Wars movie. But as always, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Don't forget to go to mynerdworld.net and hit that link on the homepage and get yourself signed up for the newsletter.
My Nerd world.
All right, let's go to a little bit of listener feedback this week. Eric in Chicago, friend of the show, said this on the new Space Opera podcast. Will Battlestar Galactica make the cut? Never got into Trek, but Battlestar Galactica remake was some good TV. Yes, I will be talking about the Battlestar Galactica series at some point on the Space Opera podcast right here. I enjoyed the series quite a bit. I haven't watched it in its entirety. I'm through a couple of seasons. There's aspects of it that I don't particularly care for, but again, it falls into that trap of unfortunately being compared to my beloved Star Wars, and sometimes my head has a hard time processing that through. But Battlestar Galactica is some amazing television, and does benefit from the advancement in special effects technology. Because going back and watching, like even Star Trek Next Generation, or even Firefly for that matter, it's really difficult for me to go back and watch those shows, or the Babylon 5s, right? Those earlier ones. Even portions of The Expanse. It's hard from that visual standpoint. I just get lost in it. One of my favorite space opera television programs, and I own all the DVDs for, was Space Above and Beyond by some of the guys that did the X-Files. I wish that somebody would grab those stories and remake Space Above and Beyond for a for a modern show. That was some really cool, low budget for its probably low budget even for its time, but did a really good job of trying to provide some believable special effects. The quality of the DVDs that I have now just don't hold up on your big high definition big screens, and the CGI work in it is so early that too is a tough watch. But the story is so great of these pilots, and a lot of what takes place in Space Above and Beyond ended up seeping into the storytelling of my Embark series. I really wish that somebody would go and revamp that with the modern special effects technology. Thanks, Eric, for the email. Owen Dowd, friend of the show, says this. Hey, man, Dune looks fantastic. Oh, by the way, Dune's another one that falls into this category of you're thrust into this universe in Dune set way in the future of a world that you have not become familiar with at all, right? That's just one. I mean, most of the space operas do that, and that's why, again, going back to Star Wars, why The Rise of Skywalker, to me, does a really great job of establishing this as a new universe that maybe you weren't familiar with before if the other Star Wars films hadn't come before it, much like Dune does, or Serenity, or the other movies I mentioned. Owen goes on to say, I read the book first and did not understand it. It is, however, a blueprint for a lot of sci-fi, such as Star Wars, among others. The 40,000 he mentions. I'm not sure what he meant. I'm not familiar with that. Such as 40K, Star Wars, among others. As a fan of the story in the 80s film, I think it's going to be fantastic. It's actually going to be two separate films. I can't wait to see Denny's take on it. Yeah, I can't either. I watch that trailer at least once a week. Recently went back and watched Blade Runner 2049, and what I'm looking forward to in Dune is that you've got a real dense story in Dune. Not a fan of the 80s movie. However, Denny has said openly that he wants to make an action movie. And so the trailer for Dune does sort of have that distinctive Denis Villeneuve vibe, because he's very much a creator of and a master of the slow burn, such as Arrival's a good example, definitely Blade Runner 2049. But he's also really good at making compelling films that aren't necessarily paced well, but the tension is always there just under the surface, that you don't need a lot of whiz-bang action to keep yourself enthralled. Sicario is the movie that's in my head right now, because that movie kind of just trucks along, but there's this underlying tension in that film that just grabs a hold of you from the opening of the movie and just does not let go. Thank you, Owen, for the email. Friend of the show, Edwin from the Lowdown Show, says this. I love Star Trek Into Darkness as well. Did you know that Trek fans hated the moment when in the film when Spock yelled Khan? They didn't like that Abrams put that in the movie. I did hear that. I heard it's the equivalent of Vader yelling no at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Just a tidbit of info. Interesting. It is, and I remember that controversy where in Into Darkness they flipped the script, and instead of having the William Shatner yelling Khan, it ended up being Spock yelling that. Also, the Khan reveal in the film, I know, was a big controversy with fans. It would not have been as big of a controversy if it hadn't been for the fact that we had social media and those ideas to perpetuate and foster and grow and infect everybody. That's just the truth of it. That same thing would have happened, as I've argued many times, if the original trilogy had been released of Star Wars and we had social networking like we do now. But we didn't back then. We had those conversations among friends, and then they died, and we moved on with life. We didn't stick to it. We didn't belabor it. We didn't let those little things ruin the experience for us. It was more of an up or down. Did you like it or did you not like it? I liked it. Will you watch it again? Absolutely. Not I'm going to do umpteenth million podcasts, going over the same ground of why Lucas destroyed my childhood and ruined Luke Skywalker for me. Gee, John, tell us how you really feel. That wraps up the show for this week. Thank you so much for checking out a space opera podcast. I almost said a Star Wars podcast because I talked a bunch about Star Wars. That will not be happening again anytime soon, by the way. We will return to your regularly scheduled non-Star Wars programming on a space opera podcast next week as we dive into one of my favorite space opera films as well, and that would be Joss Whedon's Serenity. Absolutely love that movie. So, if you want to have some fun before next week's show and you have not seen Serenity, go and watch it. You will not be disappointed. Want to remind you, too, the Embark Trilogy is available right now at mynerdworld.net or on Amazon.com. A science fiction adventure set in the future of a boy, a Star Wars and Depeche Mode fan in love with a girl in the middle of the apocalypse. And the two following books. Book 2, Treasure in Darkness, and Book 3, The Vanishing War. Gon Corbin and the Asteroid of Misfortune coming very soon. Hopefully we'll be out sometime mid to late November. Cannot wait to get that science fiction, almost comedy, out for you guys to read and listen to. And since you're listening to the podcast, and if you want things to listen to, treat yourself this weekend and go pick up the audiobooks for the Embark Trilogy. You like listening to things. You don't want to have to read. So listen to my soothing tones as they tell you a grand space opera adventure. Actually has some sound effects in it too, and on occasion I do voices badly. I know that I'm not really selling that, but people do really enjoy the audiobooks, and if you enjoy the podcast, you're familiar with me, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to like the audiobooks, and it's almost 30 hours worth of entertainment. So go to Amazon.com, search for Jon, Jon Justice, or go to mynerdworld.net and pick up your audiobook, or support the show and pick up a paperback or ebook. I would greatly appreciate it. Have yourself a fantastic week. Go watch some Serenity, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
My Nerd World.